Hello and welcome to day 3 of the Experimental Curators Hub. After yesterday's inspiring conversation between Nikala Tai, Director of the Australia Council for the Arts, and Mark Goldenfein, tech entrepreneur, so many incredible possibilities that challenge structures of funding through the ArtsPay app and how the two are working together to enable a global rollout was truly impactful, and I'm really looking forward to how that rolls out. Today, we return to the hub to two incredible speakers who I can't wait to hear from. Osei Bonsu, who's a curator of international art for Tate Modern, and who has in turn invited the incredible Nigerian artist and sculptor Ndidi Dike, who's joining us from Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for coming to the hub. Once again, for our viewers, I would like to urge you in the audience to please ask questions in the Q&A box and really put down any thoughts or comments or questions that you may have. We would love to engage with you and the rest of the participants in a dialogue with our speakers at the end of the discussion. As always, the Hub receives crucial support from our partners over the years, and we would like to thank them all. The Australia Council for the Arts, the Australian High Commission in Kolkata, the Goethe Institute in Kolkata, Take on Art Magazine and Art Review, and of course, Natasha Jinwala, whose questions, comments, and prompts always enable us to think a bit further and introspect something that I always look forward to every day of the beginning of the hub. And so without much ado, I would like to invite Natasha to take it from here.
Yes, I would just like to say that every day, at the end of the day, our dear friend and wonderful writer, curator, Mario D'Souza, has been writing about the proceedings of the day, which is available for everyone to read at the blog in the Experimenter website. So please feel free to read that if you have missed the proceedings of the past days. And all of the conversations are available to access at the Experimenter YouTube page, which is shared with links in the chat. Yeah, bridging evening for us. Over to you, Natasha.
Welcome to our community, local in Calcutta, and those of you who are watching from different parts of the world. We're thrilled to have you with us today, as we are going to be hearing two incredible people from the arts, Osei Bonsu and Ndidi Dike. I've been thinking also about how this particular edition of the Hub really brings together a propositional mode. It anticipates the challenges that are yet to unfold, as well as the current state that we are living through of being, in many cases, also seeing infrastructure, precious cultural infrastructure that is being undone, that is facing brutal challenges, especially in the parts of the world that we are also, many of the speakers are located, who are also, that our audience is located in. So we're extremely aware of the kinds of modes of difficulty that are being entailed in continuing cultural labor. So we're really thinking this time about the ways in which institutional spheres can generate the kind of purpose that is called upon by those who are the immediate audience, but also really the larger stakeholders of cultural infrastructures. And with this, really also thinking about this time of great ferment and defenses that are constantly in a kind of a knot that we are grappling with. What are the avenues of trans-regional collaboration in the arts today? This is another question that we would be continuing to take up also towards the concluding discussion. When recognizing the limitations of virtual platforms, we do wish to harness the positionalities that develop, revitalizing synergies in this world. And I'm going to quote, before introducing our guest, from the poet Mahmoud Darwish, who says, We travel like other people, but we return nowhere, as if traveling is the way of the clouds. We have a country of words. Speak, speak, so I can put my road on the stone of the stone. We have a country of words. Speak, speak, so we may know the end of this travel. And this fragment of a longer poem really comes to me also because of the way in which we're situating these different positions and kind of being co-travelers, even though we are living through an impasse, which is bringing us great disjointed conditions of reality. I was also reading this morning, and in the spirit of also thinking about the practices that we are going to be listening to today, of a talk by the great thinker, philosopher from Senegal, Souleymane Bachir Diagne, who talks about a lateral universalism and about the condition of translation as a continual effort towards that lateral universalism with and against each other, so that there isn't a structure in which there is a hegemony of worlding, but rather this universal as a continuous labor that is fragmentary, that is fragmented, and yet that pursues this sort of lateral building of solidarities. And that is how I also want to perhaps think with these practices that we are going to be hearing first from Osei Bonsu. I'm going to introduce a curator, critic, and art historian who has developed projects focused on transnational histories of art, collaborating with museums, galleries, and private collections internationally. He has curated the 10th edition of Satellite, The Economy of Living Things in 2017, an exhibition co-commissioned by Jeux de Paume and CAPC Bordeaux. Also, Osei has worked on a number of projects that include really focusing on African art, on art historical research that is pioneering, with projects that include Pangea 2, New Art from Africa and Latin America, and Saatchi Gallery, and also at 154 Contemporary African Art Fair 2013. Osei has contributed to numerous catalogs and publications that include Art Review, New African, the NKA Journal of Contemporary African Art, and he was also a contributing editor to Free. In 2019, he has recently been appointed curator of international art at Tate Modern in London. We had the occasion to meet in person through the generous invitation of Koyokuo and Raw Material Company in Dakar through the series Kura, so really also working with young curators, which was a really memorable gathering. So that was what brought Osei and me together. And for this as well, I'm very grateful. Osei has invited a phenomenal interlocutor today, who is the artist Ndidi Dike, who, as Pratik and Priyanka said, is joining us from Nigeria today, from Lagos. Ndidi is a British-Nigerian artist and has been working on extremely important topics, whether that is the transatlantic slavery histories, or whether that is truly questioning the conditions of patriarchy in our society today, bringing forward many ways in which material culture in its various locales informs the practices of contemporary art and artistic labor. We're going to also talk about some of her recent projects towards the end, because I've been really privileged to recently view her work at the Songspec, which has taken place in Arnhem in the Netherlands recently, where the projects of Ndidi really stood out, and it addressed some of these more kind of political facets of labor, as well as the current health emergency and pandemic realities. With that, I'm going to invite the two of them to take over. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and thanks Ndidi for joining me here. It's such an honor to be given a platform to talk about some of the questions that Natasha just raised. And I think in relation to that question of lateral universalism, which I think is so key to the way in which we think about our practices within the art world as being interconnected by what was marked as continuous labor, and the way in which we're constantly building on history, on ancestral memory, on, let's say, ways of thinking in a circular motion that allow us to benefit from each other's work. And Ndidi Dike is, of course, someone who has been, whose career has been hugely informative, both to myself and several other art historians, curators around the world, really interested in what's at stake for contemporary artists working on the continent today. And we'll talk about that specificity of being rooted on the continent, because I think it's key to the language, the formal and aesthetic language that Ndidi has developed. But I wanted to say, before anything else, a little bit about being here today. And of course, I'm extremely thankful to Vidi, Joshua, Priyanka, Natasha, and so many others that have been involved in organizing this convening. Because it's really an opportunity to start to think critically with an artist, or with a collaborator, about the ways in which our practices might inform each other. And I think at some level, Ndidi Dike's work is a kind of model of the way we might think about artists in a process of history making. So as Natasha pointed out, when I joined Tate in 2019, I joined with a previous background as an independent curator, and had only really worked with artists in a very kind of collaborative and open-ended way towards forms of cultural production that were very much connected to the site of exhibition making. What happens when you join an institution, of course, is you have to think about several other layers of history, several other layers of collection building, let's say, that have to do with the kind of edifice of what an institution like Tate is and represents, and how you can really bring a curatorial practice within that infrastructure. So I think largely for me, within the Africa Acquisitions Committee, which is the aspect of Tate's collection that I'm most involved in, it's been about thinking deeply about the ways in which African artists, first and foremostly, can play a role in re-narrating the stories that we tell. And I think this curatorial approach is driven largely by many of my predecessors, people who were in the role previously, like Elvira Diangani Osei, who will be speaking to you in the coming days, in addition to other curators that I had the great fortune to work with, like Okwe and Wezo, who believed in the necessity of the institution as a site in which to act and to think historically in the present. And I think to some extent that's kind of governed the way in which I've approached African acquisitions at Tate. And one of the key first acquisitions I was fortunate enough to bring forward was Ndidi Dike's History of a City in a Box, which will form the kind of the center of our conversation today. So along those lines, much of my work at Tate is concerning questions around how do we treat the museum as a space for historical intervention and activation? How do we ensure that institutions don't only become passive observers of histories or preservers of cultural memories that only belong to, let's say, a set group of society, but become engaged within a kind of pluralistic logic of history making that's about looking at all of the points of contention that might bring about new dialogues about the way in which we understand historical methodologies. Another very important aspect of my curatorial practice has been thinking about the museum as a space of artistic transgression, what it means to invite an artist into that space and have them really, let's say, redirect or remap the logic of the institution, either through working with what already exists or inventing something new. And then another part of, I think, curatorial practice within a museum is to think about what's at stake when we enter into this dialogue between, let's say, the early modern or modernism and the contemporary, and the kind of modernist mythologies that are left over from the past that we take for granted. So of course, in an institutional history like Tate, it has a lot to do with the way in which Europe has centralized the narrative of African art, very much by way of European modernism in the early part of the 20th century, and how we're still in a way as a museum trying to recover and re-articulate those narratives in ways that allow artists like Ndidi to have a better space in which to act, and let's say a more generous space in which to think. So it's about debunking modernist mythologies to an extent, but it's also about thinking about the global contemporary, which I always think about as the period that marks really the 1980s to the present, in which so many artists, and Ndidi was included among them, were kind of reframing form around around this idea of contemporary art, not simply as a kind of transaction between an audience and an artwork, but as an experience that could allow one to enter into a portal through historical memory that would then in turn bring about, let's say, change at a level of the way we look at society, the way we look at social change, all of these structures that we see within society being inflected in the logic of the museum. And among them, I would include Ndidi Dike, artists like Abdoulaye Konate, artists also like William Kentridge, who've all played a kind of vital role in taking a specific history and re-narrating it in extremely powerful and instructive ways. And I just wanted to say lastly that part of the reason I invited Ndidi specifically is that she's an artist born in London. Not many people know this, but of course, who now is based in Nigeria and has been based in Nigeria for the best part of her career. And when Ndidi and I first met at the Lagos Biennale in 2019, although we'd known each other from afar well before then, there was a strong sense of recognition that what Ndidi had been doing for many, many years in the Nigerian context had provided a model for another generation of artists. And that's why I really wanted to invite her here today, because I feel that somehow her practice embodies this very complex role, let's say, that the artist plays in navigating specific social and cultural concerns that can often be beyond the artist, or often when they're resumed, or when they become part of form, they become part of, let's say, a documentary or an archival practice. But you could argue that in Ndidi's work, she's actively in dialogue with these histories and brings them to light in ways that almost reanimates dialogues that would otherwise never have been visibilized. So I wanted to really use her practice as a model to think with, as a model of what an artist can be within a civic and cultural space. And I wanted to kind of set up the ground, let's say, for Ndidi to talk about this work, A History of a City in a Box. And I guess I could kind of ask Ndidi a few questions to begin with, but I also just wanted to take this moment for Ndidi to frame her own practice in relation to some of the things that I've talked about and what we'll be talking about over the next 40 minutes or so. Thank you, Ndidi.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the Experimental Curators Hub for having me here today. And like Osei had mentioned, we'll talk about the history of a city in a box. And I think one of the most important aspects of this work, and I'd like to just read briefly about this work, because it really pertains to information, memory, history, research, and process. So I said information is one of the greatest currencies in Lagos. Information is hidden and buried. It is accessible to the people and only permitted to those in power. I think information is the foundation on which cities are built. It is the way they operate, how power is generated, and how inequality prevails. I think the initial precursor to this exhibition, or to this installation during the second Lagos Biennale, was a work I called Depository Memory on Time, where I had gone into a former federal government printing press and had looked at various materials and had various discussions with the people that worked there. And it was called Depository Memory and Time. Fast forward to the Lagos Biennale, I had also been doing some research on the city of Lagos, on, in particular, H.S. Freeman, a photographer-in-chief for the colonial governor of Nigeria in the early 20th century. And I had come across some photographs of particular areas in Lagos, like Broad Street. And I had decided that I would like to go back to those same sites and see what those sites look like today. So that was a very important aspect of the history of a city in a box. I'd also done some...
Sorry, Ndidi, can we open up to the PowerPoint? I think Joshua will share screen.
Yes, okay.
So do continue, Ndidi.
Yes, so if you look at this first image, these are box files that were acquired from different sites along Broad Street. Broad Street is a street in Lagos that houses Center for Black Civilization, Arts and Culture, the Federal Printing Press, the Ministry of Justice, and so on and so forth. So during my quest to go back and look at and look for traces of these buildings that have still survived to today, I was able to have a lot of discussions and ask research questions with regards to how bureaucracy and how the civil service was run pre and post colonial Nigeria. And I discovered these boxes, which I felt were very important because this was before the digital age. And we all know that there's a lot of bureaucracy with paper filing, with different boxes that were titled, keep in view, secret, classified, and so on and so forth. And I was able to acquire some of these boxes, and I just felt that it is actually these boxes that built the city of Lagos in terms of the information that was normally housed inside them. And like I mentioned earlier on, information is, it's always the information given out is always selective. You have to be a part of the system before you're given access to certain things. And in a nutshell, Osei, this is how the beginning of the history of City in a Box was created.
Yeah, and I think Ndidi, what could be useful there is to talk, if we go back a few slides to the first image, about the fact that you'd come across these images, or these postcards rather, by Henry Stanhope Freeman of different buildings on Broad Street, of which the Independence Building was one of them. But more specifically, you'd already been doing archival research around the Ministry of Justice, around the federal government printing press, the Centre for Black Civilization, Arts and Culture, CBAC, which houses the archives of FESTEC, as you mentioned. So I'm curious to know, because I think it speaks to your practice as a whole, this kind of process of consistent research that really can have several different outcomes across several different projects is something that you're actively engaged in. So in a way, it's not really the archive as archivist, but there is an archival impulse that kind of lies at the center of the work that in a way is always there, right? It always continues. And I'm just curious to know, because we spoke about the form of this work, and of course what you're all seeing now is the file boxes presented very elegantly within Independence Building, but this wasn't a project where you knew the form it would take before you began. So I just wondered whether here you could talk more about that kind of process of working with the archive and what was uncovered in that process.
Okay, yes, you're right. I mean, when I started this particular installation and this project, I never knew that it would end up with this kind of architect structure. I was very much interested in the kind of materials, the bureaucratic materials, receipts, newspaper clippings from the military era in the 80s and 90s. And when I had decided to, I was working with Antoine Bird, another curator, when I decided that, look, this was the material I wanted to work with and display inside the Independence Building, which also had its own history, I felt that the only way I could actually present this work was, one, a floor piece. Two, when I saw the boxes, I immediately felt that this could also have the characteristic of a built-up city, you know, like the story buildings, like the bungalows, like the offices, like the civil service bureaucracy, because even when you look at the work, you get a sense of, oh, you could walk up to a point and then you're stopped, which is exactly what happens when you're engaging with civil service people in their offices, when it comes to sharing information, when it comes to searching for information, and so on and so forth.
So this was a building built by Capite Alberto on the eve of Nigerian independence, yes, and fundamentally was a gift from the British to the Nigerian government, but had several uses over the course of its life. And it's interesting how contained within these boxes is both the history of the building itself, but also the history of Nigerian independence. And I'm curious about, there are several documents embedded within them that if you go back a slide, I think you can see some of the markings of the files and what they were used for, but embedded within them, you can actually see the key documents, including the postcards. You can see the Nigerian Gazette. You can see documentation of key political and historical events. So what did it mean to you to be able to tell this history within the formal structure of a kind of box-like metropolis that you were building? And how did you go about, in a way, deciding which documents to prioritize as part of that process of historical narration?
Well, I think with regards to the H.S. Freeman images, I mean, that was a very important point for me, since we were talking about traces and memory and sites. of that particular time. And I wanted to create a contrast with the images from Tamfi Ofori, a renowned international photographer, who happened to be around at the dawn of independence and was actually taking pictures of the Independence Building and its structure. And then with regards to the materials that I decided to select to put inside the boxes, I was just looking at unusual, the bureaucratic methodology of how the civil service would engage with different aspects of running a city. What I also found very interesting, like I mentioned earlier on, were newspaper clippings of that period as well. Some were sensitive, so what I would also do is sort of like cover them also, you know, metaphorically with earth, so that you couldn't particularly see which I actually personally felt were perhaps too sensitive. And that was the kind of methodologies I adopted.
Yeah. Well, I think we have a video in the next slide or the following slide. I think the next image gives you a sense of the original postcard up against the structure that it's embedded in. But I think the video that you've created, and we're going to watch it, it's about a minute, is going to beautifully lay out some of the stories that are embedded within it. So if you could play, that would be fantastic.
Yes.
Lagos Racecourse is the scene, and it's the afternoon of Nigeria's great day, with thousands awaiting the climax and resolved to relish every minute leading up to it. Princess Alexandra, with Sir James Robertson, the retiring Governor General, must have enjoyed the whole jubilant atmosphere of the occasion.
One week ago, as the clocks were striking midnight, and Nigeria was on the threshold of independence, there was a brief ceremony at which the leaders of three different faiths each said a brief prayer.
The people running Nigeria have come and gone quickly since independence, but the time solemnly swear seldom changes, and so it was at the swearing-in ceremony in Lagos. 16 military governors were sworn into power on Wednesday. They read their oaths of allegiance to the man who led the New Year's Eve bloodless coup, chairman of the new Supreme Military Council, Major General Muhammad Buhari.
Their appointments as military governors of the 19 states of the Federation.
General Buhari reminded Nigeria's new rulers of their obligations and his aim to regain international credibility for the country. One of the council's first acts was to give armed citizens 2 weeks to surrender unlicensed firearms and ammunition, or face 10 years imprisonment with hard labor.
They should appreciate that the so-called diplomatic recognition by dubious characters cannot, in the least, alter the course of Nigerian history.
Thank you. If we go to the next slide. So just in that image there, you see embedded within the box, and I think it's important, Ndidi, that you talk there, because it's been and I should have given maybe a broader context to say that this work was acquired by the Africa Acquisition Committee in 2020 and will hopefully join Tate's collection within the coming years, but the really important factor within this work was trying to figure out ways of representing it within the context of a British institution, given that the work speaks to a history both of Nigeria and British colonial occupation and that transition. So I was wondering, Ndidi, if you could talk more about the specificity of those images, because of course H.S. Freeman captured, let's say, the city of Lagos with almost a kind of idealized colonial perspective. And it's a built city, it's a built environment that one might not be able to recognize anymore, because many of these structures have either fallen into disrepair or were demolished. But I'm curious to know then, Tamfi Ofori, which was the famed Nigerian photographer that you were looking at, who documented Nigeria in the 60s, post-independence, captures a very different atmosphere. So strategically, as a way of looking at these two forms of archival documentation, what was it about, let's say, the juxtaposition or the relationship between H.S. Freeman's postcards and Tamfi Ofori's architectural images? And we're going to flick through them now.
I think for me, considering the importance of an independence building, in fact, when I was doing my research, I mean, I couldn't really find much on it. And I was pleasantly surprised when I was informed that TAM had taken some images while it was before it was built and after it was built. And I felt that since we were having the exhibition inside that actual building, it would be nice to juxtapose the images of that building before it was built, after it was built. And then also at that particular time, that building was the tallest building in Lagos. And if you compare his images to the images of H.S. Freeman, during H.S. Freeman's time, there weren't any story buildings or high-rise buildings. So I thought that that difference in how cities evolve was very interesting.
Yeah. And the kind of evolution of the city also in line with a certain utopian, or you could say kind of ideological idea of what a city should be, because of course the British colonial officials had a very different sense of the city to even the sense that Tamfi Afori would have had in the 1960s. And I'm just curious what your sense was of the building's history. It was destroyed partially by a fire at one point in its history, this much we do know. And by the time you arrived in the building, it's no longer functioning, right, as a building that has any proper function, civic function. But it was the site of the Lagos Biennale. So could you maybe speak more to your initial impressions of encountering the building, probably having walked past it and maybe entered into it several times prior to showing your work in that context?
I think when you consider, I mean, our own expectations and excitement and promises of a better future during the 1960s celebrations, and the expectancy with which that period gave to us. And then you come back how many years later and you're looking at this monumental edifice that is completely defaced, is deteriorated. They've had so many fires, and the general dilapidation of the building. I felt quite sad that, you know, this building that was handed over to us as a symbol of, or the commemoration of our independence had now degraded to such a level that it's not even used anymore. But at the same time, I felt it tied in with the concept, the history, and my feelings about the history of a city in a box. Because if you remember, when we first entered that building, there were still some detritus and other important documents that we were told we were not able to touch. Perhaps top secret, I don't know. But one of the conditions under which we were able to hold the Lagos Biennale in that building was on the condition that we didn't touch those materials. So the curators decided to actually put all the materials together and put them into a box. And this is how my own concept of a history of a city in a box was evolved.
Yeah. And I think what's fascinating in Ndidi is that when we think about the city, and you talk about two, I think, very useful metaphors to help think about it. First, you think about recreating the physical architecture in a city in a form of these structures made of boxes, which of course is in the name of the work in addition to its materiality. But then there is another question around open coffins, and this idea of how we memorialize ancestral memory, let's say the memory of those who are no longer with us, who form such an instructive part of this building's history. And I'm just curious if you could speak more to the presence of both red earth, sand, and soil that's used to embed the files in a way to kind of ground them, because there does seem to me to be a logic of kind of returning to the soil, or let's say returning to a kind of a history of Nigeria that is fundamentally about land and the conditions of land, particularly off the back of so much of your work around oil and exploitative industries that have led to the devastation of the natural landscape that we're going to talk about a little later. But if you could talk about some of the material decisions that you made.
Yeah, for me, the red earth is extremely significant in terms of the fact that that red earth was brought from the southeastern part of Nigeria. And we cannot talk about Nigeria's history without talking about the Niger Delta, the oil exploration, the Biafran War, and so on and so forth. And I was just like thinking that if I'm going to talk about Lagos as a city, there's no how that I will not be able to talk about those other aspects, because it is actually the wealth from the East that has built cities like Lagos, Abuja, and so forth. So that was my own way of embedding that history and reminding us of contributions from other parts of the country that some people may or may not be aware of. And that was why I embedded and poured, the red earth within the installation. And also it talks about, lives that were lost, of course, during the war, lives that have been lost, and livelihoods that have been exploited in the Niger Delta area. So that was basically my concept by incorporating sand or earth or soil into that particular installation.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to go back a little bit further into your practice now. And I know that you've produced other works since, but I think it would be useful to sort of understand better the methodology, because I think for those curators and artists who are joining us, who are interested in questions of thinking historically in the present, but I think equally in thinking about ways of overlayering complex histories, dissonant histories sometimes that don't map easily onto one another. I think a history of a city in a box, but also the work that we're looking at now that was presented at Palais de Tokyo, I think some 4 or 5 years ago, I think sort of bring us into understanding Ndidi's methodological process, which I think is about learning from processes, let's say, that occur in everyday life, and finding ways, let's say, to bring meaning or to make meaning out of histories that have either been discarded or overlooked. And I think transactional aesthetics and the work that you do, particularly in this body of work, Ndidi, speaks so much to, let's say, setting the conditions for a work like History of a City in a Box. And I know you were thinking about Nigeria's open air markets, and I should say West Africa, because they're just as prevalent in Ghana, where my family is based. So I want to understand better what brought you to this work.
This particular work, I mean, it's a second iteration, but generally this work was created during the Jogja Biennale. I think it was 2015 in Indonesia. Yeah. And I've always had a fascination with markets. I mean, if anybody's been to Lagos market, it's like a multi-sensory assault, when you go to a Lagos market. It's like what I call organized chaos. Yeah. And one of the things I find very attractive in our markets is there's an architectonic kind of aesthetic. When you look at the way the women arrange their products, you just assume that it's a random, putting together of objects and whatever. But actually there is a conscious sensitivity to the final product when it comes to arranging all the different colors, the different textures, the different materials, the different commodities of consumption. So for me, I find them very, very engaging. I find that style of installation can actually be reinterpreted into contemporary painting or sculpture and what have you. This particular work, it incorporates images and products from Lagos and also from Jogja, Indonesia. I think the interesting thing about this particular work was that we've had similar histories. We've had military dictatorships. They were colonized by the Dutch. And when they were colonized by the Dutch were interested in cloves, nutmeg, coffee, sugar, and so on and so forth. Whereas we were colonized by the British, and they were interested in rubber, cocoa, groundnuts, palm oil, and cotton. So you find that these different continents and colonies have similar attractions that are what's the word I would use? That are evident in their history. And this was one of the things that I felt was quite interesting when I was creating this work.
And those questions around, the samples of cloves, nutmeg, rubber, wax fabrics, that kind of arrangement in a way of a sort of visual chaos that you order in this work, I think is kind of constitutive of a very, you could say, African order of reality in which all of these things are available on a marketplace at once, and there isn't really necessarily a kind of separation. So I think you kind of display them all as kind of commodities, but also as having very specific, let's say, intrinsic cultural histories that connect them back, as you were mentioned with the history of Dutch wax fabric, the history of rubber, and so on and so forth. And I'd just be curious to know about the kind of the visual order that you choose. What was it for you about kind of recreating, in a way, this kind of installation that forces the viewer in a way to kind of perform in relation to the work? Because I think talking about the architectonic, A History of a City in a Box has a similar question, where it's forcing the audience member to kind of maneuver and enter into the dialogue with the work. So they're not sculptures in a conventional sense, but they're also not installations in the sense that they don't set up an obvious division between the audience and the participant, or the audience and the viewer, which I think is important through your work.
Yeah, I think what happens with me, I mean, it's a kind of gaze that I've acquired. I haven't totally and fully understood it, but it's such an organic feel that comes into play whenever I'm playing with products, objects. It's like a natural flow of, oh, this would be good against this. It's very subconscious. It's very subconscious, but at the same time, there's what I would call maybe a method in the so-called madness. I mean, it's dictated by colors, it's dictated by texture. It's a very deep-seated organic way I have of working. I mean, if I displayed this work in another situation, in another city, it wouldn't be exactly the same.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely, and it's changed, right? It was shown at Palais de Tokyo in the exhibition City Princesses that had a very different, let's say, context. I think this is an image from that installation, so it's the second iteration. And it makes me think, I think, about what other artists, your contemporaries, really have said about the context of the Nigerian marketplace as a space of constant performance within which sounds, images, let's say forms of movement are all, let's say, imbricated or overlaid in everyday life. And that's why you can't really make a separation between being and performance in a Nigerian context. And it also makes me think about Meshek Gabar's work, the Museum of Contemporary African Art, that was presented at Tate in 2012, in which the artist reimagined the museum as a space of an exchange of knowledge, right? Through games, through processes of cultural transmission that would be based on the viewers understanding that the artwork isn't there to be simply looked at and observed, but is there to be interacted with. And I'm just curious to know at that level, and we'll talk about this, I think, in the next body of work, but a little bit about your training as an artist. In a way, we're doing this back to front. We're kind of going back to the start, but I think it would be really useful people to know about maybe how the values of Nsukka and the values of that specific historical training became foundational in your thinking around the possibilities of art. So this is a video that sort of, I think is very short, but you can get a sense of the installation in situ. And now we're going to talk about Weka into Bondage. If you go to the next slide, Weka into Bondage, which is a work that I think is so fundamental in understanding the broad arc of your practice. And it was one of your important collaborations with Olabisi Silva, who sadly left us, the extraordinary curator and cultural producer based in Nigeria. And I'm just wondering here, Ndidi, if you can say first how this project came about and how it's proved so foundational also in working with BC at that moment in the CCA's institutional history. Of course, one of Nigeria's foremost infrastructures and I would say resources, the CCA and the CCA library in Lagos.
Yes. Well, as you know, I live in Lagos, and in 2002, I'd actually gone to Badagry, which is a site from where slaves were extracted to the Caribbean, to Brazil, to America, and so on and so forth. And for some reason, even before that, I've been collecting slave shackles and different objects of historical significance from various markets within Lagos. So I went there in 2002, I went there again in 2005. And then it was strange that in 2007, you had the bicentenary to commemorate the 200-year anniversary of the legislation to abolish the appalling transatlantic slave trade in the UK. So I am busy where, when we're talking about this, why is it that a lot of the contemporary work, history, essay writings, and so on and so forth, always come from America, but hardly any come from Nigeria? Why is it always one way? Most of the information that we get to read about is actually from that aspect. So we started talking about that, and we decided that we would have a show called Waka into Bondage, the last 3/4 mile. And even when I was doing this project, I had thought of other slave sites within Nigeria, like Calabar, Arochukwu, and so forth. Another aspect that we also discussed quite a lot about was that we always hear about the Gore Island and the Amina Castle in Ghana and so forth. So this is the genesis of how this exhibition came about. And I had constructed 2 canoes. One was filled with red blood liquid to talk about those that had died before, during, and after the slave trade. And the other one was covered with about 15,000 cubes of sugar, and with about 50 sugar poured inside the boat, into which I now laid cowries, triangular mirrors, slave shackles, and empty gin bottles. There were also 3 other wooden assemblages that I put on the wall that were made out of wooden pallets. This is to do with trade. And even right up to now, I mean, a lot of the trade that comes out of our ports are always carried around with pallets. And in that regard, I was thinking about how a lot of the wooden houses used on plantations in America and various other places were made out of wood. So I had 3 quite large assemblage pieces. One was called Voyage, one was called Doors, Dwellings, and Windows, and the third was called Voyage, which is on our screen right now.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to reference how cultures still continue, like the Yoruba culture that still exists in Brazil to today. And despite all efforts to stop us from speaking our language or carrying out our traditions, they were still able to go about their normal traditions using the candomblé method of religion and so on and so forth. So in a nutshell, on this picture at the back is called Forced Migration and Lost Identities, where I'm talking about child labor and child slavery that still goes on to today. So that was basically the premise and the
totems that you build into the kind of wall-based wood reliefs are effectively a preserve of Nigerian male sculptors, right? This was predominantly used by sculptors that you would have probably practiced with at Nsukka, or that you would have at least been aware of. And I'm just curious to know.
I was aware of, yes. I told you that I actually studied painting and mixed media. Yeah. I didn't start sculpture until I left Nsukka. And of course, the work you just referenced now, those are actually police batons.
Yeah.
Because I think this work is titled No Easy Walk to Freedom, where I was referencing the civil rights movement in America. And fast forward to 2020, we now have a work I called The Reckoning, which was featured in Working Through an Impasse, a show I had with Kaleem Shagori, the founder and artistic director of Art 21. So you see these symbols and metaphors and different kinds of methodologies that I've used in my work still continue to re-echo themselves in, excuse me, in works in the present. The present work I'm talking about is called The Reckoning, where I was talking about the George Floyd Black Matters movement and the EndSARS movement here in Nigeria.
Yeah, I think what this work does in terms of dealing with the kind of history of the coastal history of the slave trade, but also kind of building that into a sort of material, let's say, set of metaphors that allow people to better understand, let's say, how, let's say, sort of complex, but also layered with, let's say, specific symbols and kind of cultural identifiers, even within the Nigerian landscape, is something that you explore here. And I'm just curious, Ndidi, if you could kind of build build in a little bit about the process of thinking towards this work and what it meant for you to present it specifically at CCA Lagos, which at that time, I think 2002, maybe didn't have the international reputation that it gained within the next decade or so, but had become an established place to show work and a kind of key place as an incubator for artistic ideas and exchange.
Yes, exactly. It was actually 2008.
Yeah.
And I don't know, my practice has always been driven by materiality. You know, I might not use the typical conventional materials that artists use. So like, I mentioned the slave shackles and the other manilas that I've been collecting for years. And at that particular time when I was working with the late B.C. Silva, we'd had so many discussions and we had decided that, this time it would be three-dimensional. It will be actually more, there'll be more sensitivity and tactility to the work. And CCA was a great space where you could dream about exhibiting anything you wanted to. Because I can remember asking BC, are you sure you don't mind that I hang bolts from the ceiling? And she said, no, that's fine, go ahead. So it's also about the person you work with. It's also about the space, and then the freedom to express unconventional ways of showing your art. And that was one of the things that CCA brought to the table.
Yeah, well, I think in a way that's a curatorial permission, not that I'm sure you needed it in Ndidi, I'm sure you would have done the boats anyway, but I think created, the foundations that became, the very explorative form of your practice that I think continually kind of reminds us of the importance of making space for artists within certain structures, and how that in turn can kind of liberate possibilities around form, but also, let's say, ideation that allows us to expand what we think of as a curatorial, let's say, model. So I think that there is so much to unpack, and I think we're going to wrap up there to open up to questions. But I think that there would be so much to unpack there, I think, from audience members who are interested either in Ndidi's recent work or some of the more historical concerns raised. And I'm going to bring in Natasha again to open that up.
Yeah. Thank you, Osei.
Thank you so much for building this dialogue. It also felt the intimacy of that dialogue was really special. It felt like we were kind of listening into something that really was a lot about the thinking between each of you. And so thank you for sharing so generously. Through one work, you really opened up an entire cosmos for us. Really also the way that you talked, Ndidi, about the kind of organized chaos, the ways in which Lagos as a city is so central to the kind of African imaginary and its futures to come. And I wondered, just if you could draw a little bit also into the kind of challenges that Lagos as a city and that Nigeria is also facing in terms of course, the pandemic, but also various other kind of infrastructural challenges. And how do you see the art community be able to kind of continue their work through this time? Because you've made an important decision to also return to Nigeria to study and then be part of this incredible scene. So it would be really great to learn from you about the current times as well.
Yeah, I think I had this discussion with Osei the other day, and when you talk about the challenges of being an artist on the continent in particular, because of the way it's structured and because we get so little funding from anywhere per se, artists have learned to find a way to practice and produce work with very minimal resources and reliance on grants and other avenues for art production. Of course, during the pandemic, it was much worse. But generally, artists here, I really don't know how they do it. Even me at times, I don't know how I do it. We find a way to navigate and are still able to fulfill our desire and passion for producing artwork here on the continent.
Yeah.
That is not to say that we don't get a little sponsorship here and there, but generally, I mean, the kind of grants and institutions that are available outside, let's say, Nigeria that I know about are not really available here.
Yeah. I think, Ndidi, maybe you could say something too about the recent, let's say, civic and political movement around NSARS, and there was a very growing sense among artists of the kind of violent terrain that artists now occupy, let's say, between what's happening politically, and then you also just being an artist trying to survive within a fragile ecosystem, as you just mark. So how do those political events weigh in, I guess, to what you make? Because I think what I was trying to demonstrate at the beginning is how much your work constantly responds to these conditions and doesn't shy away from it. It's not as if you have a studio practice that is neatly tied into painting or sculpture. It's continuously evolving in dialogue with these concerns.
I think what happens is that some of us artists are affected by the political environment in which we live.
Yeah.
There's no how the creative or an artist living in Lagos during the NSARS demonstrations will not be affected. I think for me, it's about how do you talk about these kind of movements in your work? And I think I did that to a large extent in the work called The Reckoning, which was part of Walking Through an Impasse exhibition that I mentioned earlier, where I had spoken about the Black Lives Matter in America, and I'd spoken about the NSARS demonstrations in Nigeria. And the work was actually inspired by a quote from Wole Soyinka. So what happens is that inevitably, I think, your very existence is determined and fed by the political circumstance under which you're living at that particular time. So I don't think there's a way to ignore it. You've just got to find a way to talk about it, to draw people into it, to talk about the history, perhaps if there are solutions. And that's just something that I'm constantly engaged with in my work. And even, as you mentioned earlier, Osei, even when it comes to natural resource extraction, I've done that with work I talk about in the Congo, with the coltan. I've done that with the vanilla from Madagascar, and so on and so forth. So I guess as an artist, I'm politically, socially, and deeply aware of this layering of different circumstances of things that exist outside Nigeria. And that's just the way I feel I want to express my practice.
Yeah, I want to add one thing there, Natasha, because I think it might be instructive. I was asked a few questions earlier about what I think the role of an institution like Tate might be in relation to curatorial models. And it's interesting because I think so many people, I think rightly so, I think thinking about the kind of cultural politics around restitution, are questioning what it means for a large-scale Western institution to continue to collect from regions within which there is so little infrastructure, let's say, for museums and cultural institutions to support artists locally. And it's brought about a really interesting question in relation to how we collect work by artists on the continent. And what I've continuously said as someone that's worked on and off the continent is it's not about the volume of what we collect or even its scarcity, because so often this is a kind of currency that drives particularly the interest in modernism. It's like how rare an artist's work might be or how difficult to kind of draw it into a collection. And I would say that in Ndidi's work, it was very clear to me that a British public could learn just as much from that work as a Nigerian public. And it became a work that becomes somewhat of a portal to enter into a historical exchange that an artist was enabling. No curator could make a history of a city in a box, or even an archivist or a librarian, right? It's only an artist that can create the conditions for that work to exist. And that's all I've ever wanted to emphasize, I think, through my role at Tate, is this sense of historical activation where artists are not just being acquired by the museum, but are entering into an open dialogue with the conditions of a museum like Tate, which of course comes with its own baggage like any other cultural institution, which I'm deeply aware of. So I think Ndidi was very sensitive to that, and we had many discussions around that in the lead up to the acquisition of the work.
Yes.
Thank you both. Yeah, we are open to questions by the audience. I have several, but please do put your questions and comments in the Q&A bar, and we'll be taking them up throughout the conversation time.
Great.
Also, I wanted to check in with you all about, I was recently in Paris and I had the opportunity to visit this wonderful exhibition that is called Diaspora at Home, the collaboration between CCA Lagos and Cadiz. It felt as if, again, there's a number of practices, a range of generations, also responding to these conditions of the way that diaspora has for generations linked cities like Paris with the continent, with the notion also of the African world as something that is also constantly in production, and lived through these bodies in ways that are violent and yet transgressive as well. And I'm really thinking about such models of collaboration. What is your thinking as an artist and curator about such collaborative modes or models? And at the same time, also thinking of Sartre, for instance, saying Europe is a province of the world, so not centering Europe in these kind of moments of exhibition making. Also, Ndidi, of course, was in Paris and did an extremely important exhibition there. And they're taking up the question of housing, for instance. So once again, of informal economies that surround diasporic communities and their lived challenges in a city like Paris, which is also, of course, one of your addresses, Osei. So if you could maybe
I think, Natasha, that's an incredible context in which to think about Ndidi's work. Because I'll just say briefly, Ndidi, from my perspective, I'm dual heritage. My mother is British and my father is Ghanaian, and what that's brought about is a constant sense of anxiety of being feeling that you're neither. In the sense of your kind of cultural heritage and what you can claim. And I think what's very interesting in the role that we all have as curators, we do take our own biographies into our work, our own intellectual biography, but also our own actual biography, right? Where we choose to live, where we're able to live, which visas we're granted, so on and so forth. And I would say for the generation of African artists working in the 1960s, and I mean at a diasporic level, who were so invested in the cultural politics of post-independence, so interested in the possibilities of Pan-Africanism, I think they did set a model for cultural exchange that many of us are still now trying to reclaim, because it feels like such a moment of possibility, both in terms of its kind of utopian sense of liberation, but also at the level of cultural exchange. And there was something very interesting to me, and I asked Ndidi about this, about the fact that she was born in London and then, of course, spent the majority of her working life in Nigeria, and yet at the same time continued to keep connections. And so did BC Silver, and so did several other artists and practitioners. And I would say, in asking Ndidi about the generation before her, people like Demerson Nwoko, much before her, but still really important and living artists like Demerson Nwoko, Bruce Onabrak-Peya, who really kind of paved the way for African modernism at a global scale. I think in a way what's interesting now is to think about a kind of rerouting of intergenerational maps that might connect an artist like Ndidi, who practiced at Nsukka, that obviously connects her to Oluwagribe, to Ellen Itsui, even if she was making painting at the time and not sculpture. So I'm continuously interested in a kind of politics of remapping and redrawing the future, but I'm equally interested in how artists sort of change that route, and in a way how, for us as curators, Natasha, they kind of interrupt our thinking, and that's what I want to Ndidi interrupt me if I'm going off course.
No, that's fine. I agree with you. Excuse me, sorry. I agree with you. I think what changes is it's not necessarily your experience at your university. I think it's what happens to you when you leave. Mm-hmm. And how you begin to navigate the terrain as a professional artist, holding exhibitions, going for residencies with virtually no help whatsoever. I think it's that circumstance that actually trains you, maps you, and forces you to be able to engage with the situation in which you find yourself.
Yeah, it's very true. And Ndidi, how did you perceive when you started to discover the because we talked a bit about the Festec archives, and for those of you who are interested, there's a brilliant book published by Chimurenga that covers that history in documentary terms. But there is still, I think, so much work to be done on kind of unpacking the cultural relationships that were created as a result. And Ndidi, this is the big bomb here. You attended Festec. You don't remember it that well, but you attended. So could you talk a little bit about what that moment signified, if anything, in your deep memory?
Yeah, I remember I was actually studying music in the University of Nigeria in Nsukka then.
Yeah.
Because I studied music, majoring in music education and majoring in voice before I finally went to my one and only love, art.
Yeah.
And I remember we had a visitation all the way from Nsukka to Lagos for Festec 77. And what I remember most about that period was the vibrancy, the excitement, the expectation, the issue of Pan-Africanism, and just a general sense of hope and optimism during that period, and how proud we were to have the largest Black gathering of people on the planet, and all that kind of thing, with poetry, with music, with fine arts. And then Lagos the population wasn't as large as what it was now, but then everything worked. It was such an exciting time to be an artist. It was really, really a good feeling then.
Mm-hmm. It's incredible. What I would say, as in addition to that, though, is that we're in this really interesting time, and I did want to make a note, because it's easy to kind of idealize the past, particularly the utopian past. But I think indeed the Biennale of Lagos has become a very important force. Of course, CCA Lagos paved the way for so much of what we now think of as small arts institutions on the continent. And I guess what I've always been interested in, thinking from the scale of an institution like TAPE, is how we learn from those smaller organizations and become in a way useful partners or interlocutors. And I think that to some extent, speaking with Semi Bello-G about the Lubumbashi Biennale, or speaking with, I don't know, Ibrahim Mahama about what's happening with Red Clay in Ghana, there's very much a sense that artists are redrawing that map of institution building on the continent. And I'm curious for you how that kind of has been useful or not, in terms of having an international career, that you can work in Lagos and have a biennale like the Lagos Biennale that, as young as it is already making a huge cultural impact for artists, both emerging and established.
I think that is one of the dynamics of a place like Lagos, the kind of exciting, interesting possibilities that one can bring to the table, despite what I call an unenabling environment for artists. Artists are still doing exciting things. They're taking up challenges. And like you said, Lagos Biennale is relatively young, but the kind of exciting things that happened during that period were really good. You had, of course, CCA was phenomenal in that regard. I tend to think that organizations and institutions that are led by artists or curators or art historians definitely have more, that bring more to the table than the old established universities.
Yeah.
So I think they definitely play a very, very important role in the evolution and expansion of contemporary art in Nigeria today, no doubt whatsoever.
Yeah. It's very interesting because we always talk about the cultural emergency in, let's say, developing context, especially on the continent, in relation to the absence of curatorial practice. But what I'm very insistent on at the moment is that areas like conservation, areas like archivation, areas that involve directly to do with kind of custodianship and thinking about caring for an object over time, or caring for an artwork, are the areas that feel most urgent to me, Ndidi, because in many ways, the ideal scenario would have been that we could have shared a history of a city in a box with a Nigerian institution, and potentially become a kind of partnership, and there wasn't really an avenue to pursue that. But my hope is that in the next 5-10 years, those models are going to grow to become substantial enough to be able to actually, let's say, sort of conserve and preserve works for, for the next generation. So I think there is so much to unpack there, and I think your work does it in interesting ways, also in terms of its critique of ephemerality. And this is something I think that you and other artists talk about, this kind of shift away from object-oriented practices. You could say an artist like Dineo Sachiko Pepe has a similar take on this, where I ask her, when is she going to make a sculpture? And she says, never again. And it's this very interesting commitment in things that are not meant to last forever, right? And the politics of that. So I'm just curious, Ndidi, whether you have any thoughts on ephemerality and how that plays into your work, given that I think for Natasha, I think for so many of us as curators, it presents both a challenge and an opportunity, I think, in working with artists.
I think when it comes to ephemerality, I think it's more about the history of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's more about the materiality, and if it's those kind of materials that you feel are adequate to express what you want to say, then you have to use them. I think for me, that's the most important aspect.
Yeah, yeah. We've got no questions in the box so far. Natasha, do you want to shoot us with another one? I don't know how we're looking for time.
Sure. I was really enjoyed listening to this moment also of revisiting the idea of Festac, because of course there's the history, and through the work of Chimurenga and many others, it's been revisited in different ways. But what does it continue to hold for us as an idea, as a prompt, as a possibility today, also within the various kind of divisive schisms that continue to exist in the continent? That mode of alliance building is definitely one that, without idealizing, as you said, perhaps still something that we can kind of continue to draw from. And I was wondering, in that regard, like there are also other artists. I was just remembering, like Akinbode Akinbiyi, who said he photographed there, and it was a very early moment for him to actually pick up the camera. So even Festac being like a prompt to pick up the camera and to photograph this moment in history. So no, thank you for sharing that. And I wonder how perhaps models like that compare in regards to perhaps biennial making, which again, of course, falls short at many levels. But I wonder if there is a kind of new model that we could even conceive of that is more in the spirit of something like a Festac, but also continues to sort of treat in real time the kind of divisive sort of energies that are also continuing to remain challenges in terms of imagining that kind of unity or sense of hope within the cultural domain.
I think it's really interesting, Natasha, so many of the things that you mentioned, and you would know a thing or two about biennales and models and rethinking them. But I would say, having not worked on a biennale as a curator, but having assisted on several, I feel like there is something really exciting and dynamic about the possibility that the Biennale still holds as a kind of cultural meeting point. Often it's where you and curators like you and I and artists like Ndidi, where we meet, where we converge. But maybe that point of convergence that we're in this very moment over the next 3 or 4 days is just as valuable, right? And that it doesn't necessarily need to conform, let's say, to a structure that, let's be honest, is built on a 19th century model of world making, which has to do in a way with encyclopedic discussion around knowledge production. And I think that one of the things that strikes me about Festac, and I don't want to misrepresent Tem Fiofori here, Ndidi, but you mentioned that at one point in his career he might have managed Fela Kuti.
Well, it wasn't him, it was
someone else. But we had a kind of speculative conversation around it. And
no,
it
wasn't him.
Well, it wasn't him, so we'll let him off the hook. But I think there was something about the kind of speculative nature about thinking about artist networks at a moment where things were much more interdisciplinary. Even the relationship between politics and art, of course, one thinks about Senghor being a kind of poet, artist, politician, and how unthinkable that is now as a condition of being a politician, right? That one is actually open to culture and really thinking expansively about the world, even though he obviously was a divisive figure in his own right. I would want to return to the idea, and maybe to Ndidi's point about where Nigerian politics finds itself, given that artists like you, Ndidi, who are world leading in the work that you're doing and have garnered so much attention internationally, not necessarily being embraced or, let's say, acknowledged in a local context. And I just would say that I think that has to do a lot with politics, let's say, in a kind of global sense, having been somewhat now divorced from culture and society even, but there is a real issue there that you see across several contexts. And of course, I can't speak for every context, but even in the UK, one feels it in the devaluing of art history degrees, or these things being taken off the curriculum systematically. So I wondered if that's something that you're seeing in Ndidi, or that you could speak to in terms of a shift. Sorry, Natasha, I've gone so far away from the question, but I think it's still related. Yeah.
I think, when artists on the continent, when we talk about different topics, like right now, there's the whole talk about climate change. There's the whole talk about electrical cars.
Yeah.
So I instantly think, oh, where is cobalt going to come from to manage these batteries and electric cars that everybody's talking about? At the end of the day, the whole world will go green. Who is going to bear the consequence of that?
Yeah.
Right, Osei? That's what you mean, I think.
Yeah.
So,
well,
I don't know, when I look at things globally, but I also look at the consequences of what's going to happen to the continent, because most of the resources come from here anyway.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think it's the idea, perhaps, Ndidi, though, that you and I talk about often, of kind of reclaiming that power. And of course, artists don't have necessarily, in some cases, they might sort of a hand in government or policy, or they can't necessarily, let's say, reshape the world to their own will. But there is, yes, I think, a sense in which artists like you, and we can think of others, and Natasha's mentioned a few, who do really demonstrate this idea of thinking very expansively about a kind of certain shifting of worldviews, that, yes, I think they do it in ways that are, in a way, nudging the audience to start to think critically about the conditions of contemporary society. And I just wonder whether, particularly in the work that you're going to go on to do in Ndidi, does this feel now perhaps more urgent than ever, given where we are also after the pandemic? Because I think, as you point out, the gaps in economics, but also GDP, questions around the sort of the sustainability of our ecosystem, Africa bears so much of the weight of that. And how is that informing your future practice or your current projects?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I've done quite a lot of work on the natural resource extraction, in terms of cobalt from the Congo, in terms of Manila from Madagascar, and so on and so forth. I've touched on gold, I've touched on latex as well. And I think it's inevitable that in my practice, I'm going to continue to talk about this layered history of materials and acquisition and exploitation of our resources.
Yeah, I think we've got 10 minutes left.
Can we take questions? Yeah, can we take some questions? So
I can see
there are
questions. Yeah.
quite a few now. So one is from Sunil Shah, who congratulate you on your work in the conversation, and ask what useful dialogue do you think emerged from some of these themes in Ndidi's work for British art audiences in relation to the colonial past, hopefully complicating colonial histories and exposing intercultural relationships?
Yeah, I think exactly that. I mean, Ndidi, you can speak to it because you've shown across various contexts. And of course, I think this will be the first acquisition of your work by a British museum. But I know your relationship to London stems back and to Britain stems back much further. There was a contingent of Nigerian modern artists in Britain in the 1960s. And at the moment, a lot of my research is around Pan-African modernism as it surfaced in a British context and trying to understand that. But I would say that the really interesting opportunity within Ndidi's work is to not actually think about it as a work, but actually as a I think tool is the wrong word, but in a way as a kind of as a historical document, in a way, made up of several other historical documents that allow us to retell the history of empire in a very different way. The Tate is such a large organization with such a deep collection that it has many images that can speak to the historical representation of slavery through, let's say, the subservience of Black peoples and ethnic minorities. It has works that maybe re-narrate a certain personal history of colonialism as told by a diaspora artist that's looking upon it. But to actually draw documents out of an archive and to instruct the viewer in a different way of looking, I think is what History of a City in a Box does. And I think it's what all artists at some level should feel a responsibility to do in a way. It's like you've made this work, but then how does it serve an audience in turn? If indeed you want to show it to a public. And I've always said that artists now have to think about an audience when they're producing a work, because I think we don't necessarily need more objects, right? We know that we don't necessarily need more works of art to be held in an institution simply just to exist on their own terms, but they have to help us to figure out the ways that the institution can think transgressively about our own histories. So I think that would be what in the ideal scenario, we've not presented History of a City in a Box. What it would mean for Tate is it would really shift the way we tell that narrative of Nigeria's transition from British rule, and how that in a way persists in the built environment, the lived environment of Nigeria in the present, and kind of connects the two sites historically and geopolitically. But Ndidi, I don't know if you want to add anything there about History of a City. You said so much.
No, I think you said it very well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions by our attendees. So how do you navigate working at an institution that was designed to exclude people like us? I'm reading directly from the question. I often feel like I'm constantly speaking to this binary, me against them. Do you think we as BIPOC communities are speaking to the white community than speaking to our own or for our own? And also in this regard, if there's something that you could transform about the institution that you're working with, and I assume here, this is for you, Osei, I think, what would that be? And of course, clearly to just indicate that you're not just, you've recently joined the Tate in London, but you've worked with a range of communities and institutions, and I'm sure you will continue to do so. So, yeah.
I mean, Natasha, I'd want to ask you that question, because I think being at Gropius Bout, can I throw it back to you as the moderator and chairperson in respect to your own organization? Because I think to some extent I learned so much from my conversations with Natasha and other colleagues that we had out there in the field who are doing really important work. And I'd just be curious to know as to how you would answer that question, because I think I'm still, the answer changes for me continuously. And I'm happy to answer it after. It's not a cop-out. I'm just curious to know what Natasha thinks.
Sure, I'm happy to take that on. And for me, it's been a process of continuing to work across the hemispheres, almost in a sense that, which is becoming, of course, very, very challenging in this moment, but I'm continuing to always maintain a sort of nonprofit side of my practice, which in this case is located in South Asia, which is also one of my homes. And I think being that sort of insider, outsider to institutions in Europe, and also models like biennials, has been a way to continue to also be a host for communities that struggle to feel welcome or be invited and hosted generously within some of these institutions. And so I think our labor is not only to create concepts and invite artists to kind of compose exhibitions with us within the institutional body, but in fact to also navigate through many of the unresolved aspects of our own life, because it feels like it's something that's happening really, again, in the present, with all of the cracks involved, all of the flaws. And so I think what we can do in terms of our generation is to really, as you said, Osei, I think we're constantly learning to configure what to do beyond the official roles and designations. What kinds of sites do we want to create that are also kind of within the condition, but also putting ourselves out there as a resource for artists who are really working in the informal and kind of sort of informal or unorganized sector of where there is not this kind of funding possibilities and so forth. It feels like we're moving in between, in a sense, and for me that's been really crucial.
I think it's really crucial, but it's also, Natasha, and I think it's something that's not lost on so many of us, how privileged a position that is to some extent. And I've been trying to understand my work more and more, I think, as you articulated, as a kind of double agent, so that I'm invested in, let's say, the kind of a prosperity of an institution that is somewhat of a kind of, you could argue, a sort of a center point for certain narratives around art history and certain possibilities of, let's say, a museological construct that is founded on a Western idea of what a museum could be. But equally, I'm invested in the possibilities of artists being invited in, but not only that, opening space for a certain kind of transgression that can only come through curators realizing that our responsibility to narrate has to do with this idea of having multiple points of conversion, right? Multiple points of let's say, historical juncture that meet when we enter into dialogue with an artist, but also equally when we visit a certain country or we visit a certain environment where we might not be necessarily knowledgeable or have the language to navigate. And that continually happens to all of us on the African continent because of its diversity as a tapestry of cultures and let's say communities that Ndidi and I as Nigerians and Ghanaians respectively of the diaspora don't necessarily have the same points of political historical reference, but we have to meet at a point of understanding what we could gain from one another by entering into that process of exchange. So I think thinking about the curator as a double agent is one model I would probably think with. And then in terms of the question around thinking in relation to historically white organizations and who it is that we are creating exhibitions for, whom is it that we're addressing in our desire to think about exhibitions, I think it's much more a question of intentionality, and this idea of making an exhibition should always be a process in, I think, letting go of certain ideas. And I think for me in a historical context of an institution like Tate, it's been about really thinking critically of about the audience who might not necessarily have the language to articulate cultural difference, and to think a lot about, Stuart Hall's thoughts on translation, and to think very much around the kind of politics of an institution that has to be able to serve those who aren't necessarily, let's say, seeking to be challenged, but how that challenge can be brought about in ways that are absolutely transformative when you create an open space for a dialogue to occur. So I think somewhat about a kind of, in a way, against this idea of an encyclopedic exhibition, I hope that the future exhibitions that we're able to curate across large organizations at Tate speak much more to the localized conditions of a context like Lagos and what Ndidi's doing, and actually learn from those works and from those artists. I think kind of gone are the days of kind of thematizing or categorizing arts in ways that are neatly understandable or digestible. So I think there is a huge amount to overcome, but I wouldn't say the problem is necessarily unique to Western audiences, because you could argue in a African context, there are still people who aren't receptive or interested in listening to complex histories. And I think that's what Ndidi's work kind of surfaces. So I think it's less so much about a culturally specific audience as it is about kind of widening the margin for historical transformation through the model of exhibition making, whatever that might be. And to be honest, Natasha, I think the way you've convened this, it's kind of like an exhibition of thought, because you're bringing together all of these extraordinary ideas from different people in different parts of the world. And I think that model is just as valid as an exhibition with, a certain layout and a floor plan, etc. To me, there is no difference. And I think that where we should be beyond, I think, thinking about things in those ways. So I hope that goes some way of answering the question, but I think so many of us, it's very easy to speak about this, have to demonstrate it in our practices. And I think that's when it becomes slightly more challenging, I think, for all of us. And it's where I think curators have the most to learn from artists, that we can't just be present for certain moments and then absent when it's convenient, right? But that we have to stay with the trouble and invest in the aspects that make our work difficult and challenging for all sorts of reasons. So again, a long-winded one, but Ndidi, do you want to add anything to the, okay, you're making it easy for us. We're almost at time.
There's quite a few questions now. I'll just take one or two more to try and combine them, because and Ndidi, maybe if you want to answer, there's also this question to you in terms of, to what extent do you feel when working within institutional structures in different parts, are there expectations posing a limit to your sort of artistic approach, whether that's the history making and history telling, or also the kinds of materials you work with. I mean, just to add on to that, right? Because they also are materials that really pose a challenge to the idea of collecting itself, and to the idea of the museum's perhaps mechanisms of securing a work itself, which is I think the really fun aspect of the way that you choose to handle materials and their embodied ways.
I haven't worked with any specific institutional structure. I mean, throughout my career, I've been working with individual curators, and I've worked with CCA, I've worked with Art21, I've worked with the National Museum, and even when I worked with the National Museum, I was the one that curated the show. So I've not really had those challenges of impositions of maybe the will, shall I say, when it came to, specifically with the museum, when it came to my working with the museum. And I guess that's why a lot of us artists decide to work and curate our own work. And like I mentioned earlier on, we don't get any support from government institutions anyway. So that's why I haven't worked with them.
Yeah. I think it's also as though to do with trust, Ndidi, because obviously you and BC Silver had this relationship that had stood the test of time, I imagine, all the way up to her passing. And I got to know Ndidi, I think, in the last 5 years that she was with us, but you know, she was an extraordinary mentor to so many people. And I wonder, in relation to Natasha's question, as to whether it's about, or the question from the audience, as to whether it's about a trust that you build, whether that artist-curator relationship is important to you or has proven instructive. Like you said, even in the boats hanging from the ceiling and the permission to get to do that, is that important to you, fostering those relationships?
Yes, I think what comes to bear when you're working with people like you, people like Antoine Bird, people like Colleen, one thing I've noticed, and with BC, is that there's a depth of relationship, and there's a depth of intuition. I think it's important that when you're working with a curator, you don't feel sort of like oppressed.
Yeah.
And in all the people I've worked with, even in my continuous discussions with Osei, it's always very free. You know, there's no imposition of will. And once you have that that depth and that understanding with whoever you're working with, then you won't have a problem, because there's a mutual respect going on between the two of you. And in some instances, we're always thinking on the same page.
Yeah.
So once you're able to imbibe that when you're working with people, then I don't think you're going to have a problem. Also, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. There's sage words of advice, but it's not my experience across the board, Ndidi. So you're somewhat of an exception for me. But that's to say that I enter every dialogue with that intention. But it depends on the artist, and I think equally it works both ways. But I think it says something about your charm, Ndidi, that somehow every curator that you've worked with, you've enjoyed that relationship. And I think it means you're doing something very right, I think, and probably working with the right people along the way. But I think sometimes also as curators, there is a divide between, you know, what it is that we might be trying to achieve and that artist's intention. And that's why I mentioned the word intention before, and you talked about intuition. And I think they're woolly words that have become theoretically very unfashionable, but I think hold a lot of weight in our personal relationships. And I think it's often those words that are not mentioned enough when you do curatorial theory courses, or you do, you know, these words that are very much about human relationships and about honoring a certain commitment to a person that has almost nothing to do with professional practice, but is about a trust that is deeper and based on, in a way, the kind of ethicity of curating. As I always say, conscience, a constant sense of anxiety or somewhat overthinking what's possible because you care, right? So I think there's a lot to unpack there, but thanks for that, Ndidi. I think that was a really useful response for the artists on the call, especially.
Yes, thank you.
Should we have a final question, Natasha?
Well, there's a couple more actually, and if you can take 2 more questions, that would be great. I'm trying to filter these as well, and but I would like, since the audience is very active, it'd be great to take some. So just for Ndidi, if I could ask you this question of, as an artist now based working out of Lagos, the question is, you address materially through your sculptures and installations the ideas of Pan-Africanism, as we spoke. You dig into history and project what is possible in terms of understanding our current condition. But how to kind of continue establishing non-Eurocentric perspectives and disrupt the structures of seeing and experiencing art that is emerging now out of Africa? Because there's also another question that is about how you observe the younger generation that is working from there.
Sorry,
and how do you sort of...
Can you say that again? How do I can't quite hear you. How do I?
Okay. What is important for you in establishing non-Eurocentric positions continually through your work, and also observing the kind of structures of seeing and experiencing art that is emerging out of Africa today?
Excuse me. I guess this could be, I think this is dictated by the topics I decide to address in my work. Like Osei had mentioned before, I mean, I talk about global issues. They're not really confined to a particular concept or a particular history, but there's always an overlaying and lapping and intertwining of various histories.
And Ndidi, you talked to me before about the global South, and we talked about the kind of politics and challenges around that term and that terminology as being always put in opposition to, I think, what Natasha just mentioned as the kind of Eurocentric view. And I sometimes struggle, sometimes that African art is always defined in opposition to what artists in another part of the world are doing, and often compared favorably or unfavorably. But I think in your work, that's what's interesting. It doesn't seem to be a kind of reference point where you're going back to a particular period of modernist history, or that you're necessarily referring to a particular canonical idea of what art should look like. I mean, I think this, I don't want to open up too much of a Pandora's box here, but I do think it has to do, indeed, with you practicing in painting, shifting to sculpture, but then also refusing the category of sculpture as a space in which to work. And about the Eurocentric ideals around what art should be, I think the form, the very form your work takes, speaks to that. So does that make sense in some way?
As we discussed the other day, all these terminologies and titles and whatever they call them, I remember for a very long time, we are even till today, we're referred to as the third world, and I can remember having this discussion with the late BC Silva. I said to her, BC, what's another name for third world? And then we came up with societies in transition. So even this issue of the global South and the global North, you cannot ignore it. I'm sure in 10 years' time, there'll be another name for addressing whatever's happening on the continent. And for me personally, I think the global North and the global South, I think it's relevant. Yeah,
that's, I think, amazing, societies in transition. And I also think that it relates a lot to Achille Mbembe's talk about Africa's history as being an archive of permanent transition or permanent transformation. Yes. I mean, I think that really speaks to the conditions of your work, indeed. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Final question, Natasha. I don't know how long we're supposed to go for, so I'm just trying to be mindful of other people's time.
No worries. We have 5 more minutes for our session today. So just to maybe wrap this all up together. I think the way that you're also discussing these terminologies, right? I mean, when I sort of started also with thinking about Suleiman Bashir Diagne's lateral universalism, and at the same time societies in transition, ideas of what a majority world perspective looks like, that would definitely include people like us, and how institutions that we enter into also are it's a negotiation process with them. So when we are being asked, for instance, also how do you then view the kind of models that are coming forth from the continent? So whether that is the Lagos Biennale, or there's of course also there's a new Triennale in Stellenbosch in South Africa. There are these kind of new models that are being made at such a challenging moment also on the continent. How do you see these in connection to the sort of dynamics of international organizations that may be physically, located in sort of the Euro-American context, where again, many of us are getting positions for the very first time. So there's a great responsibility, and it's easy to sort of also, say, okay, this is a separate story, but there is an interrelation that is just that is fundamental, that we also need to acknowledge. So maybe just to wrap up the questions that have been asked, and our own positions within them.
I think that's an extraordinary way to think about it, because I think as much as those models aren't entirely new, we all know about the Triennale, the Biennale. It's not so much about the categories we give them, but what they liberate for artists, what kinds of aesthetic, political, social possibilities come about through these platforms effectively, which is what they are. And I think it's the best way to think about them as kind of platforms where artists can act and react. But I would say that for, being centered in London means that I have the privilege in a way of being able to oversee so many aspects of whether it's artists traveling to, the city for exhibitions, or thinking about ways in which my access to the continent is often filtered through being a British citizen, right? In addition to being Ghanaian. And what I've always tried to do in relation to what we talked about earlier about the curator's responsibility to think with artists and to think very much as being kind of agents for a specific kind of institutional change, I would say that it's about decentralizing, which I know is sort of, again, slightly contentious a term, but I think it's so central, I think, to the way, ironically, we think about an institution of the 21st century, because we know that the internet has liberated so many possibilities in terms of our connectivity. We're experiencing it in the here and now, but I think in turn, what it's maybe done is it's kind of somewhat dissipated or undermined the physical connections that we make in real time and space through moments like biennales and various forms of international meeting points or platforms. And I would say that if an institution like the Tate Modern can become a kind of meeting point for certain forms of artistic transgression, and become a space in which African artists feel free to think about their own histories and that they can fully lay claim to the possibilities embedded within those histories, I think that we're doing an important job. But I think equally it has to connect back to something more fundamental, which is the ways in which those, let's say, entities, be they small-scale biennales or growing institutions on the continent, actually feel that they actually feel invested in that work and invested in that form of cultural exchange. And they should also be allowed to opt out, right? They should also be allowed to say, I'm not interested in engaging in that dialogue. And I think that extractivist culture of curators going to a country just to research artists for a biennale has to end. I think we have to become more localized. And I think, Natasha, without naming you, I think you're a great example of a curator that embodies that way of thinking. But I think it is difficult work to do because it involves being more invested in, let's say, artists who are, let's say, practicing in environments where they're not immediately accessible and they may not wish to be found. I had an experience in Dakar, just to use an example, of an artist that I spent about 4 weeks trying to meet, and it's when I met you, Natasha. And when I finally met him, he was so open, but part of the game was getting to know him, and it happened to be El Hajisi, and we spent a very long time circling one another. But I realized that was his way of not making himself immediately available to a researcher or art historian. And I think African artists should have the right of refusal. And I think large-scale Western institutions have to be extremely sensitive to the history that precedes our engagement. So I think that's what I always try to do with Ndidi, is to be aware that we were taking a history of a city in a box in order to care for that work, but in order to give it a life that might prove to be useful for those who wanted to really understand this history, not just simply to add an additional artwork to Tate's collection. It was really shifting the way we could tell a particular story. So that would be my take. And Ndidi, if you want to add anything. Oh, don't do this to me. You've got to add something to end. I don't want to.
You're so articulate. I mean, what more can I say? You said it all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Natesha. It's been such an honor, and the whole team. I mean, it's been a dream to work with Experimenter, and thanks for those questions. And hopefully we'll continue the discussion offline, and there'll be more.
Yes, and indeed, I mean, this has been a great, really great session. Thank you so much, both of you from Lagos, from Paris, to join us today.
Thank you very much.
We also are going to bring you back. So it's going to be on the last day where there's going to be a dialogue with all of the guests of this edition of the Experimental Curators Hub. On the closing day, we're going to have a dialogue together. And so it's also a moment for us to speak with each other, and also to take up some of the other questions that we may not have been able to answer today. And with that, we close for some rest and to let these things enter further deeper in our minds, but also then to hopefully return for our audience tomorrow. We welcome you together with Ratanmol Johal, who has invited the fantastic team, Emily Jasser and Aline Khoury, who will be speaking about their work in Bethlehem, but also the kind of resonances that exist between their work and other places. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Osei. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Fantastic. Such an honor. Good night.
Thanks.
Bye.